progress.
Right, I think we are live on the latest in the series of webinars that the Ministry of Justice and the Justice Committee are putting on to explain the laws that have been passed and exist and are operational in Asgardia. And today is a particularly prestigious webinar as we have two chairs and two people involved in Asgardia really from the outset. The Chair of Government and Prime Minister and the Chair of Parliament. Welcome to you both, and thank you for finding time out of your incredibly busy schedule to talk about what is a really fundamental piece of legislation which defines the operation of the government and to some extent sets out parameters with which the government acts as opposed to the Parliament. And I think it would be fascinating for people interested in Asgardia and for those Asgardians who want to learn more and for those in Parliament and I'm sure government ministers to get your personal perspectives on the creation of this act, what brought it about, what does it do, and any funny stories that you've got about it along the way. So perhaps we could start with the Chair of Government and the Prime Minister talking about the inspiration behind the act and how it helps her to keep the government in order.
Thank you, Mr. Beer. First of all, of course, welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today. It's a very special day for me. We bring forward to you for information and familiarization a document which was maturing through the years of Asgardia developing. I would ask my assistant now to share the screen so you can see in which scope is the government working. As you know, the next slide, Asgardia is run by the Constitution. The Constitution of Asgardia defines its main scope. So, yeah, indeed. So that's the main law where democratic nation and constitution was developed and passed the national referendum at its very onset. And then there was another referendum for including amendments. So the government activities are defined by Chapter 8, Article 35 of the Constitution. You can find the Constitution on the Asgardia website at asgardia.space in the section Government. In the section Constitution, and then you can open it or download it in your language. It's there in 12 Asgardian languages, and you can also read specifically more about the government if you like, but in general it's also the basic document, and every Asgardian, every resident of Asgardia should be familiar with it, of course, at your own convenience. So Government Act is defined fully within the scope of the Constitution, and it was passed originally at the onset, and then the amendments were introduced further to adapt the activities of the government in line with the progress of Asgardia. If we go to the slide then with the list of people, I'm humbled and honored to serve as the Prime Minister, now already for the second term. And this is the government ministers. As you can see, the 12 main areas of work are covered in the government, all the same areas as you would find in the committees in the parliament. So we cooperate very fruitfully with the branches in the parliament and also with administration to the head of nation. As you can see through the title of the ministries, these effectively are the 12 areas of operation of Asgardia. And in order for this operation to be smooth and efficient, of course, it needs to be defined. I also would encourage, excuse me, everyone to follow our news. We hold biannual webinars as the government to inform the public about our activities. So I expect the next webinar will take place towards the end of June, and these are the people who will be telling you in detail about our work. But in the meantime, indeed, I would like to talk more under the guidance of our brilliant Minister of Justice and with support of our wonderful Chair of Parliament, how exactly the process is ongoing when we develop legislation, what specifically this means when it comes to the Government Act. Because, of course, everything needs to be very finely tuned for things to work smoothly. So we can go back to the main screen and continue our very interesting conversation. Minister Beer.
Fantastic. Thanks for that introduction. And I suppose one of the questions I've got is, as you say, second-term prime minister, one of the world's only digital democracies. Fantastic. Why did it take so long to develop the Government Act? Why didn't you create it when the Constitution was created? What took all those years to ferment and to develop?
Well, I think this is the question for me and Mr. Opik to respond to in a dialogue. I, of course, have my point of view, but there is also the practicality of how the nation evolves. Have you ever seen a nation starting from scratch? I'm certainly not old enough to have seen that. And so, of course, Asgardia was started on the 12th of October 2016 by its founder, Dr. Igor Ashurbeli, who is now the head of nation also, elected by the national referendum. And the parliament was formed as in the process of developing Asgardia. So, in a way, when you plant a seed and expect a major tree to blossom, you still need to give it time to go through its infancy. So the constitution was adopted, the parliament was democratically elected, and when it started operation, the parliament had to go through the obvious, to me by now, but also I was very naive in that way 7 years ago, but the foundations had to be laid. So I would like to ask my wonderful colleague, Mr. Opik, to give a few words briefing people on how the foundations were laid. And then I'm sure we will conclude that the Government Act was passed exactly when the time was right.
Well, like any prime minister, it's good to it's certainly good to present that picture. Lembit, legislation lags reality. Is that what happened here, or is it right that the best things come in time? Is that what led to the Government Act being created out of years of experience? Any memories you've got of it passing through three readings of Parliament?
Yeah, practical experience. At the end of the day, you just can't do everything at once. Quite literally, Rome wasn't built in a day, and the same goes for Asgardia. The first thing we had to do was get the parliament to work, because the parliament was elected, and 150 people were elected in 2018 when I became the chair of parliament for the first time. We had to get that to work first, because in a sense, that was the motive power for everything else to follow. We also had to get the executive in place. Now, the executive is basically the 12 chairs of the committees, the 12 ministers, and the 12 administrators for each of the departments or ministries. And then you have the gang of four, if you like, the head of nation, chair of parliament, head of administration, and prime minister. And we really needed to get all that into place before we worked out how government worked. It is a monumental task, as Lena has said, to set up a new political system. And remember, Mark, what we were trying to do is make sure we took the best of democratic systems and leave the worst aspects behind. One of the best aspects will be working together. One of the worst aspects, in my opinion, is having political parties, because political parties then fight for their own existence, and they're willing to compromise decision-making in order to protect themselves. So we had all that to do before we actually got the government working. Second point, in reality, it took us 2 goes to get Parliament to work, because we didn't really know how to do it. No, there was no precedent, really, no sensible precedent for it. So we started Parliament, we tried it for a year, we started government, we tried it for a year, and then we had a reset. And all of that had to happen while we were trying to work out how government works. Which leads to the third point, which Lane has already covered, the process. Now, there's a 3-part process. There wasn't really a 3-part process from the very beginning. We even evolved that. Initially, there was just a 1-stage process. So even while we were making the Government Act, we were changing how we were making acts. And the process was quite sensible, actually, because we already learned a lot in the first 18 months. And then the Government Act, which actually did come out along quite early, tried to remain consistent with what the other things that we had passed were saying. Putting all that together, Mark, it's actually quite amazing that we haven't had more problems because we've tried to learn the best from Earth and as I say, leave the West behind. Just 2 more thoughts about it. Everything needs amendment sometimes, but we haven't really needed to change very much about how government and parliament interact. There are protocols and etiquettes that we are still learning, we're still maturing. But as far as the Government Act itself is concerned, and you might want to talk about that in a minute, it's actually been quite effective. I would say one last thing, which is I think we're still working out how best government and parliament should interact. And we have some protocols, but over time, experience will resolve that. And you don't need laws for that. You just need good relations. So not everything that the Government Act does solves all the problems. Some of it takes experience and maturity, and you can't legislate for that.
And that seems to be where it's come from. It seems to have come out of a synthesis and an understanding, and clearly defines roles and responsibilities on the one hand of the ministers and the prime minister, and therefore on the adverse side, the roles and responsibilities of Parliament. And as the Act was going through three readings, Lembit, which is the classical approach to legislative review, early stage vision statement through to very complex drafting. Throughout, there does seem to have been that collaboration between the government side and the parliamentary side, including these webinars which have come out of this, which is a collaboration between the parliament and the government itself. Was there anything, though, Lembit, during those three readings that you remember, any concerns that Parliament had about the division of labour or the division of effort between the two? Anything particularly that Parliament wanted to ensure was clearly delineated within the Act?
Who's in charge was always the conversation that people spoke about offline. And that continues to be a dialogue, actually. So it's a very human ego thing. I think there's less ego in this case because people want to get things done. And I've noticed very much in the last 8 months, people really want to get things done. So to some extent, the biggest test of the relationship between Parliament and government will be in the next 4 years, I think. But in terms of the question you're asking, people were worried about the detail and thinking, oh, are we giving away power? Is this going to make Parliament secondary to government and so on? I remember when I was a British member of Parliament, they used to have the same conversations all the time. Oh, are we giving away too much power? Oh, exactly the same things. And I think that in the end, I like Elon Musk's approach, trial by doing. Sometimes you'll get it wrong, you'll crash, and you'll get it right again. So far, we haven't really had a major crash or any constitutional crisis. The other thing was not really a problem, but associated with this, there's been a question about hierarchy. Technically, government's appointed by Parliament. That's the process. But and there's been some theoretical discussion about what that means. And once again, in everyday life, it doesn't matter so much because ministers and chairs and MPs have to work together because there only are 100 and altogether about 170 of us to do all the work. So we had theoretical conversations. And so I'd summarize my answer like this. It's something I learned in business. For every 50 questions we were asking, we only needed 4 answers. And if something comes up, normally it's better to work it out when it happens rather than trying to think of every single possibility because you never will.
Fantastic. So, as chair of government, are you comfortable now with the amount of power? Does the government need more? Does it need less? Is it refining itself? Is it working? What do you think, Prime Minister?
I think that this has far too much framework of a personalized ego, because the Constitution clearly defines in Article 34 the Parliament as the legislative body elected by the people of Asgardia, and then the government is an executor. So I have to say, I found out just something new from my wonderful colleague, because I don't have any illusions. Like I always say, I'm the most grounded person in our space nation. So I actually read the Constitution and I act by the book. And I make proposal for the Government Act in line with the Constitution, and I promote it by the book. So I'm actually surprised to hear this historical anecdote that there were some doubts about the intentions behind it. I can assure everyone, starting with this panel and of course promoting it into the entire universe, that we as the government of Asgardia are totally committed to transparency, cooperation, and operation within the defined framework. It's the only way we can develop right and operate in space eventually. Because imagine even on Earth, uncoordinated actions can bring havoc. By the way, to something Lembit said earlier, there are no laws on maturity. It applies to the entire humankind, unfortunately. And it's an excellent idea, I think, we in our own countries where we live and operate, we maybe should recommend our politicians to pass laws on human maturity and rights which are associated with this, because otherwise the world is so unstable. That's one good thing about Asgardia. We stay clear of terrestrial affairs. It's in the Declaration of Unity. Actually, the Declaration of Unity was passed before the Constitution. It's the first document ever of Asgardia defining its broad scope. And in the Declaration of Unity, which you will find in the Constitution as page 1, it says that Asgardia does not interfere into Earth affairs and expects reciprocity, and that Asgardia, in its build-up and development, is leaving behind earthly history. And there have been questions, actually, what this means. No, we're not wiping our brains, of course. But what we're doing, we intentionally hold ourselves from referring to it. We're building from scratch. We're building on human excellency and on human genius, on the vision which Dr. Shurbeli brought forward for creating Asgardia and entrusting us in taking it forward until it started running as an independent democratic state, as it is operational now. So we are a classic democracy with 3 independent branches of power: Parliament as a legislator, cabinet as an executor, and court, which is an independent justice system. So I can only say that we have always done and always will be continuing our work in line with those basic definitions which guarantee our transparency, independence, and honesty in the operation.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
Just to clarify, Mark, Parliament wasn't thinking this was what in the English language is called a power grab. People did not think that government was trying to steal power away from Parliament. It was esoteric. It was a theoretical debate because people
it's human nature.
Yeah, people
it's
get
human
scared.
nature. Yeah. And what I like about the Act very much is, and for those who get the chance to read, it's available on the Asgardia website. What I like about it is it sets some pretty clear parameters. This is how government is formed. This is how ministers are appointed. This is how ministers will operate. This is the remit of ministerial power, and this is how ministers might be removed from office. It's clear. I think it's like most legislation that Asgardia passes, if not all, it's actually a very useful piece of legislation and a useful tool by way of reference. There is one overlap in there, which I'd be grateful for your thoughts on, which is that ministers are appointed by or with the involvement of, or you might say by Parliament. So Parliament does have a critical role in the operation of the government. That's one defined area within which Parliament has a critical role to play in the operation of Asgardia. Lembit, your thoughts on that as a crossover between the interaction of Parliament and the operation of government?
Yeah, it's logical because the members of Parliament are elected by the entire residential population or citizenship in future of Asgardia. So they have accountability to the whole of Asgardia. And so it's rational for the ministers who are not elected by the residents. It's rational for the Parliament to own that accountability too. So it's the best. The only other way to do it would be for the head of nation to appoint the ministers. Now that's actually what happens in British Parliament, and it really slightly what happens in America, but not so much. So you could have a situation where all of the ministers are appointed, for example, by the Prime Minister. In practice, the Prime Minister and the ministers are all, the Prime Minister is approved and the ministers are all approved by Parliament. And it's just to maintain a democratic accountability. Remember that I myself am elected by Parliament in the same way. What that means is that if I do a bad job, then Parliament can get rid of me. A vote of no confidence would be enough. It's something understood. It wouldn't be realistic for me to stay in the position if 51% of Parliament wanted me to leave. In the same way, there are systems to no confidence the government. However, the practical answer to your question is we probably won't get there. Certainly not in my political lifetime in Asgardia. That would require Parliament to be so unhappy with the government that it would use that power. In practice, we can have disputes and we have dialogues, and most of these are offline. Most of them are informal conversations. So we fix things in a different way. We may be exporting the human race to space, but we're not inventing a new human nature. So we'll still have the same sort of pressures that human beings always have. And so there is a technical way that Parliament can formally cause pressure on the government to leave. But in practice, we have never been anywhere near that, ever. And so I don't think that on a day-to-day basis, Parliament is spending its time demanding a report card from government. And it would be very distracting if we did it. It would almost be in bad faith. Just one last thing. Remember that most of the ministers actually started off as parliamentarians. So they have an emotional relationship with Parliament anyway. And I personally think that's quite healthy.
Prime Minister?
I would be a bit of a nerd here. So I would ask Merrily, please, to share the presentation of the Government Act. I believe it's page 4, or where the Article 6 is. It's the first page of the slide. So it actually answers the question which was asked in detail. The next slide, the right side of this slide, indeed. So the Article 6 gives the technical answer to the question we're discussing, and it's developed here, elaborated in detail on the basis of the Constitution again, because the Constitution defines the Parliament as the body to whom the proposal is taken. So there is also a special body in Asgardia, which is called the Supreme Space Council. So the Supreme Space Council is actually reviewing the proposal for the Prime Minister candidacy, and then the Prime Minister candidacy is submitted by Supreme Space Council to the Parliament, and then the Parliament votes for the Prime Minister. And then the Prime Minister proposes to Parliament their candidates for the minister positions, and then the Parliament votes in order to approve these proposals. So it's a very finely tuned process, which is described in detail indeed in this document. So since Lembit has very correctly described the narrative part of what this entails in human terms, I think for the completeness of the picture, it would be useful just to refer to Article 6 of the Government Act to answer this question. And that's indeed how it went. So there are other provisions because, for example, since the government is appointed by Parliament, or rather approved in line with the appointees, then when the Parliament completes its session, its term, 5 years term, then the government is considered automatically resigned because the Parliament which approved the nominations is no longer in power. So we have been through this transitional period, for example, because after the election of the first Parliament in 2018 and its successful work for 5 years, the term naturally ended in line with the Constitution in 2023. After 5 years. So the new parliament elections were called by a decree of the head of nation. And then automatically by the completion of the session of parliament, the government was deemed resigned. So the government was appointed by the head of nation as acting government to make sure that all the current work continues. And then when the new parliament started their new session, again, we went through the same procedure. So everything we do is absolutely meticulous, in line with the intention and the letter of the laws which are developed in Asgardia. That's also, in a way, an answer to a question, why did it take so long? Because actually we're not just doing something for the sake of creating a nice picture. We're actually taking time to make sure that it's done to the best of the abilities at this stage of Asgardia's development. I'm sure there will be further development and some new things we'll have to take into account, which we couldn't think of right now at the onset. But at least what has been passed, what is in the system, what can be found on the Asgardia web page in the documents section, all of this has been developed with a great attention and a great degree of responsibility and commitment to accuracy, precision, and the Asgardia goals. Since we are on it, of course, I have to mention to those of you who don't watch us often enough, the main mission of Asgardia is the birth of the first human child in space, said by Dr. Igor Ashurbeli, the founder and the head of nation of Asgardia. And the purpose of this goal is to achieve life in infinity of a human being as a biological species in the universe. Because once humans can procreate in space, it means that they can settle there, settle further, of course, travel back to Earth if they wish so, but it also makes them not bound to earth. So everything what the parliament is doing and government is assisting where appropriate is developing the legislation base, which works not only now, not for the next 10, 20 years. A big effort is being made to anticipate how these laws will also work when they are applied for people living 100 years down the road in a space station, either in the Asgardia National Ark. You can see the diagram of our intended progress in the brochure. It's also on the website. So the first will be Low Earth Orbit Station. It will be called Asgardia National Ark. The next will be Asgardia Lunar Ark. It's an space station at the cislunar orbit. Yeah, you can stop sharing screen. And the station after is called Asgardia Star Ark. It's an interplanetary station. So the laws which the parliament is now so thoroughly and diligently developing, they are well thought through in order to be sure that they cover all eventualities we can possibly anticipate for the decades, literally for decades to come.
Excellent, and I think, look, that was a really good explanation of the broader picture of Asgardia. Let me change tack a little bit. Within the Government Act, there is a mechanism, and I think you just alluded to it, Prime Minister, for the Parliament to reject proposed ministers. And I wonder, Lembit, have you ever come close?
No. We've never come anywhere close. In practice, we're talking, as Lena's correctly described it, we're talking about the technical procedures, and you would think maybe that this is all touch and go. It's knife edge. It's down in football terms to penalties. It's not. It's always 95-2 or 80-10 maybe. And the reason is because up to this point, while technically, as Lena says, Parliament does, and I said, Parliament approves the ministers, and therefore the ministers are technically accountable to Parliament, as is the Prime Minister, as am I. In practice, what's really, in real life, what the protocol is that we're setting through precedent is that the Prime Minister will tend to make the proposals, not usually all at once, some ministers, then some more ministers. And then Parliament decides whether they want those people or not. And actually, there hasn't really been a dispute yet. I promise you, at some point in the future, there will be. There will be a controversial person. To use an example, if, for example, a future Prime Minister in 100 years' time proposes Darth Vader as the Foreign Secretary, that'll probably lead to some debate. And depending on the situation and who's in charge and where Luke Skywalker is at the time, whether Luke Skywalker's in Parliament or not, then there could be debate. So there is a system there, but it has not been tested. The reason for why it has not been tested is because at this stage, everybody in government and everyone in Parliament is there for a common interest, a common goal, first baby born in space and the first permanent human space habitation. So we're not divided on factional lines. I also think that because we don't have political parties, that makes it better, because then they're less likely to form power bases for their self-interest. And that's probably one reason as well this happens. Just one last thing, which I'll share. These webinars are meant to be insightful. There's a lot of debate beforehand. In reality, by the time a list has been presented to Parliament, there's been a lot of consideration, a lot of proposal, a lot of private discussion. Parliament and the public don't see that, but it's essential in a decent political system. And so we have had those dialogues face to face. We've had arguments in the past face to face, and that works both ways. That's not written in the Constitution. It's not written in the Government Act, but it's written in the mind of any responsible and mature politician, because it's so much better if you have your disputes quietly, where nobody loses face, no one is embarrassed, so that by the time we get to the vote, usually it's a fairly safe bet. But as I say, that will change. At some point, there will be a dispute.
Fantastic. And I mean, the one thing that the Government Act also does is it clearly defines the powers and responsibilities and obligations of the chair of government and Prime Minister. So perhaps I could ask you both separately, and I'll ask the Prime Minister to go first. Where do you see your powers to be distinct and separate from the other chair's powers? And where do you see there to be significant overlap between your powers and responsibilities? Prime Minister, why don't you go first?
Well, thank you. First of all, I would like to say that while clearly this is a very legitimate and conventional, I would say classical question for a debate of that level, I want to make a somewhat lyrical remark that with great power comes great responsibility. So while I understand in which sense the word power is being used here, I would like first of all to say something I briefly mentioned when I was introducing the cabinet. First of all, it's a great humbling honor to be in this position. So for me, it's not about the power, it's about the privilege of having been entrusted to be for this period of time to be in charge of this position. So as we discussed, that's a classical democratical system with independent branches of power. Like Lembit says, we didn't have significant debates. Yeah, I was about to comment, look at how convincing I am. You would not win anyway, so it's very wise of you not to argue. And, but I would also challenge if it's Darth. I would also challenge if it's Darth Vader versus Skywalker, or if we should run the vote if it's Kirk or Picard, but I would hold it back for now. And so for me, of course, if we're back to being serious, which is, first of all, on our job descriptions, again, I sound like a broken record. We run by the Constitution, we run by the book, we run by the Government Act. The ministries have codes which define the operation of each ministry. So when it comes to unique responsibilities of everybody in the branch of power, we do not need to reinvent the wheel. We cooperate in line with the established working routines. We're still adopting them and progressing. You see, when you work all in the same building, or at least in the same city, once in a while you can have a coffee with a colleague, you can have a lunch together, you can have dinner together. Really not like let's have lunch and never call again, but proper lunch. And so people not only have official work routines, but they also naturally cross-fertilize when they develop projects and ideas. In our case, we all are all over the world. If you look again at Asgardia website, there is a map where you can see where Asgardians are. It's literally all over the world. There are over 230 countries, people from which are represented in Asgardia. So for us, anything we want to do is a digital world. We were doing it long before the isolation where the whole world was forced to go into Zoom meetings. By the time this very sad situation occurred, we were actually ahead of the world in being operational this way. We were using Zoom since we started operating in 2017. So a lot of things are still the trial and error because people do not naturally run into each other, and in a way some extra formalism can be an obstacle, but I'm very pleased how we managed to overcome it. I call it drinking coffee in a digital corridor, because again, we live in the day and age when everything which is put in writing is becoming official. So indeed, the moment we start having formal exchanges, we adhere to our own routines to make our own work possible. Otherwise, things get out of control. But at the same time, I have great informal relations with all the peers and all the branches. And it's only natural that people just talk to each other because there are so many ideas, there is so much brilliance in the organization and the people who became the civil servants. A lot of things truly they cross-fertilize simply by being thrown in the air, by being in the environment. So in the modern esoteric world, they call it, I am in your field. So for me, being in this field of Asgardia actually brings so many unexpected, nice surprises. So while we remain totally committed to operating within the protocols and separating the power, we of course overlap to an extent where the common sense lets mature people do that.
Very good. Chair of Parliament, to what extent do you see that your role is very clear and distinct and areas specifically for you, and to which areas would you say there is an overlap between the work of yourself and Chair of Government?
The distinct areas are, my role is to ensure the smooth operation of Parliament. That specifically means the formal sessions, that's the digital and physical sittings of Parliament when we all get together for 3 days, according to protocols which I'm proud to have helped to establish. Also, the smooth operation of the 12 committees in the 12 key areas, and to ensure that they are making practical progress in, for example, the fields of science and equity and resources and so forth. And thirdly, to ensure that Parliament is sensibly represented when that is relevant. So, for example, I was in Dallas for the total solar eclipse and honored to go to Colorado Springs for the Space Symposium, 39th Space Symposium. And that was a responsibility that I was able to carry out, partly or largely because of my status. In terms of overlap, well, that third one is first, because the Prime Minister could have attended the total eclipse or the Space Symposium. So we can share those kinds of public appearances, and I'm not sure that the Space Symposium cared very much if they were talking to the Chair of Parliament or the Prime Minister of Asgardia. They just wanted to speak to senior operatives in Asgardia. So that's an overlap. Second overlap is in terms of the generation of legislation. Although Parliament expressly and specifically votes on it, we do have informal sessions called Asgardian Legislative Forums, ALS, ALFs, which we have them about once a month, and everyone's invited. Ministers and AMPs can, as Asgardian members of Parliament, can both attend there and have pretty much equal status. I chair those because most of them are parliamentary, and it's essentially a parliamentary session, but it's not a constitutional session, so there's no vote. There's an overlap, very clear overlap. Also connected to that, ministers can initiate legislation, so can anyone in Parliament. So that's an overlap. And then the third area is project management. I'm just using this because it's a recent example. The Dallas Eclipse event was organized by a team of AMPs, led by Sarah Clark and Teresa Jones, and assisted by TJ Williams and by Jason Berry. It happened that they were Asgardian members of Parliament, but it could have been a minister. Cheryl Gallagher, for example, is running an initiative to do with the moon and launching things there. So any of those people can generate an initiative, and then those people who are interested and want to be involved tend to do so. Last area of overlap is in terms of promoting Asgardia as a whole. Where early days, all of us are ambassadors, and to me, the one thing we need to do more of is reach out, and it doesn't matter if you're a minister or a member of Parliament or a chair of a committee or me or Lena or any of us really. We can all reach out to people who might want to be involved in Asgardia. Of all of those, the thing that is most visible is actually probably the last one. Phoning up a television station or a radio station, submitting an article for a newspaper, physically attending a local space symposium. Those are things that don't need something in the Government Act or how Parliament operates. They need something in us to motivate us to go and do it.
Indeed, I would resonate with that, because of course there are things which are defined by the legislation, and then there are things which are common sense and the practicalities of our current life. So in terms of public representation, Lembit and myself can certainly replace each other in all the functions where either of us can be invited or will have to present. That's clear. And when it comes to outreach, there is also an initiative by which we encourage all the civil servants, and we do our best to lead by example, to reach out to the local communities and to the local media, promoting the goals and the ways and the mission of Asgardia. That's beyond the scope, the formal scope of being a civil servant, but that's the reality which we're living in. And in a way, Mark, I can ask you, because you are here as a host and the mastermind of the webinar series, but at the same time, you are the Minister of Justice. So I know you're also doing a lot in your work in promoting Asgardia. And actually, may I ask you to give one or two examples which you shared with me in the past, where you spoke about Asgardia just when you were performing your real task, your main job as an international lawyer?
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk about Asgardia in the context of the law, because as you know, in space there is no law, certainly not as it applies to the private sector. So with the economic ambitions of the private sector in space, Asgardia presents a platform through which we can develop laws and regulations which apply within the space environment. And that's very exciting. You know, we're one of the first nations in the world to pass a DAO Act, Distributed Autonomous Organization Act. And that as a model law is something I think that we'll see other nations start to develop as the world becomes more decentralized. There's a lot of firsts that we're putting through, including the ability now to arbitrate through Asgardia for all entities, whether involved in space or whether the company is set up in Asgardia or otherwise. So there's a huge amount that we're doing at the cutting edge of a world which is becoming increasingly bound by geographical borders, boundaries, and barriers. To say, look, there is an alternative way. One does not need to be tied in to a world of increasing tariffs and taxes. One can look to provide a set of regulations and laws which can have universal application across space. And that's hugely exciting from a lawyer's point of view, and we talk regularly about it. As you both said, we're sort of everybody that's involved is passionate about it. And an ambassador for it. I mean, what I certainly hear, and I think you've both been very polite in not mentioning the phrase herding cats, because I do know that both of you spend a lot of time in shaping and developing and bringing people together, because what comes with having enormously talented parliamentarians, and with the exception of myself, really, really talented ministers, what comes with that is the need to sort of corral sometimes to make sure that everybody's on the same bus going in the same direction for the same vision. And you both, if I may say so, do a fantastic job. And it's very evident, the fact you're both here today, the level of cooperation and collaboration that goes on. I'm going to invite the audience to send in questions if they like. I only have one last question for the Prime Minister, which is more of a practical one. When I'm sure the audience listening to this will dash off to the Asgardia website to review the Government Act. And when they do, Prime Minister, it says within the Act that there is the power of government to appoint deputy chairs of government and a chief of staff. Now, I don't know the answer to this, and they always say never ask a question to which you don't know the answer. However, I don't know the answer to this. Has the government appointed deputy chairs and the chief of staff? And if so, let's alert the audience to who they might be.
Well, no, the simple answer is no. So indeed, there is room for I wouldn't even call it room for improvement, rather there is room for enlargement. So like we discussed before, the acts which are passed are developed with a view that they should serve for years or centuries to come. So we leave as little as possible bureaucratic work to those who come after us, and they can do all the fun technical things which we probably don't get to do in the next 5 years, at least when Lembit and I are in service. And so the way the structure is defined, indeed, it sets space for appointing deputy chair of the cabinet, so deputy to me, and then also every ministry can have not only a minister, but also a deputy to the minister. And so far, the practicality is such that we are not a huge organization, and this over-bureaucratization and extra staffing basically does not bring anything extra. It brings bureaucracy rather than act. So, for example, one of the colleagues who facilitate this event today, Merrily, she is an assistant to the cabinet. I can as well call her a chief of all our common sense and running things smoothly, because she keeps us all under control and on schedule. So we are at the moment a small, compact organization, and we can afford to operate in an unbureaucratic way, and we are reaping benefits from that, I would say. So in practical terms, okay, if I drop dead tomorrow, there is no official deputy who otherwise should automatically take over. Okay, so if I drop dead tomorrow, you will have this problem to sort out. I'm sorry. That will be one of my motivations to stay alive for now. But for the rest, the situation does not require yet to have all these positions officially filled. We are efficient as is. But at the same time, Mark, I'm afraid your announcement might have sounded misleading, as if you encourage people to apply to those positions.
I do. I think we were announcing job opportunities here on this webinar for all those who are not yet involved in Asgardia but have ambitions in government. You see 3 job opportunities are opening up on this webinar. But what I hear from this and what I'm getting out of this is the desire constantly, when thinking about operating government and legislation, to be flexible, to be adaptable, to learn from the past, but plan for the future by putting in potential job opportunities for the future, to make sure that the legislation is flexible enough to deal with what we've learned, but at the same time to allow us to pivot and adjust as things go forward. And I think that has to be the way. And I do love, Prime Minister, how you're creating a government which is not bureaucratic. It's probably fair to ask the person on the webinar who has been in another parliament to say whether he shares that ambition of a non-bureaucratic government. And then, if there are no questions from the audience, we'll wrap up. So, to the Chair of Parliament, a non-bureaucratic government, is there such a thing?
There is such a thing in the same way that there can be a garden without weeds. Bureaucracy grows like weeds, and you have to keep stopping it, because two things happen. Number one, things go wrong, and then people introduce new legislation to try to stop it happening again, instead of saying, well, it went wrong and it won't go wrong very often. And the second reason is because bureaucrats like bureaucracy. There's a clue in the name. And we tend to get people into positions in civil service roles, this happened in the UK, who love the idea of looking at the tiny detail. Now, I think you could look at it like this. NASA is a bureaucracy, and SpaceX is a trial and error culture. So one's a bureaucratic culture, one's a trial and error culture. NASA would not want to have their test rockets exploding all the time. Elon Musk says they'll blow up, but as long as they go further each time, we'll get there in the end. The interesting thing is that Elon Musk makes far faster progress than NASA, and NASA still lost 2 space shuttles. So this is down to mindset and worldview. I am more willing to see mistakes happen, and then we fix them, and sometimes things go wrong, but most of the time they go right for the sake of the speed. So sometimes I'll guess an answer, because we're still making things up in Asgardia's parliament and our civic system. I'll make things up, and then if they don't go right, then we'll fix them along the way. A lot of the systems we're using have actually been created like that. There are others who say that's too risky. If it was a matter of life and death, I would agree. But when it comes to legislative processes, I like the speed with which we've achieved things. Finally, Mark, I predict that we will become more bureaucratic, because pathfinders, and I suppose in some ways experimentalists like me and Elon Musk, eventually tire an organization out. They have to consolidate. And that's when bureaucracy comes in. And I don't really like bureaucracy. I'm not good at it in my life. I don't do bureaucracy. I don't do administration very well, as everybody, including Lena, knows. That's not where my strength lies. But for a system to be stable in the long term, it does need to have basic systems. Can we minimize bureaucracy? Well, I like to say yes, but in reality, of course, that's down to the individuals appointed. And in Britain, we have massive over-bureaucracy at the moment because of the way that the system thinks. In Asgardia, we do not. And at the moment, we can still make quick decisions. Once again, we work things out. We're about to start having a lot more projects. And I think that will be a big test, because if we can keep the bureaucracy down, then we'll get the output up.
Fantastic.
I would like to make a couple of nerdy remarks, because
well, I think it's only right. We're wrapping up now, and we're talking about the Government Act. So it's absolutely right that the last word goes to the Chair of Government.
Okay, I can't promise it will be the last word. We still have 5 minutes. So first of all, one nerdy remark about 3 job opportunities. According to the Government Act and according to the Constitution, actually, the deputy to the Prime Minister is one of the ministers. So that's not a job which would be open to the general public. If we ever advertise that, would be an internal decision. The same like for the Chair of Parliament, the deputy is one of the chairs of the committees in the Parliament. So tentatively, these are only 2 job opportunities you're promoting, not 3. The other thing I would like to mention, that while this is still in the making and we are not sure at which stage we will make this next quantitative, not qualitative step, qualitatively everything is defined, I would like also to remind that Asgardia has some areas more advanced than the others. It's natural, it's the natural progression of events. And the very developed area for practical purposes is the operation of the Ministry of Trade and Commerce. So those of you who want to register the business in the jurisdiction of Asgardia, please visit asgardia.trade. I believe there is, or I'm sure there is a webinar also in the series which covers the law which defines the operation of the trade and commerce system. And I would like to mention, and that's how I thought of talking about this, that actually Minister of Justice Mark Beer is the first person on earth to register his legal business in the jurisdiction of Asgardia. And that, again, I'm sure, Mark, maybe you can spare a minute to share your motivation to do that.
Well, absolutely. Although I have read clearly in the Government Act that ministers can't promote their own personal business. So I'd only say that if you look me up, I have the first law firm in space, and I as my witness, there's 2 chairs. I hope I'm not going to suffer as a result of that. But yes, it is possible to own a company in space for any of those of you out there as fascinated as I am with the concept of the law in principle. The idea of operating in an environment like a satellite in space is pretty cool to own a company. It's very easy to set up. So Asgardia.trade and set up your business in space. Be amongst the first. Be a pioneer. We've heard some really fantastic things here today. I love the fact that we've got the 2 chairs together. Clearly, great minds, great people, great vision, great collaborators, but also with clearly defined roles. We've heard about the Government Act, how it defines and delineates the role of government, how Parliament and therefore democracy plays a role in the operation of ministers, not something universal around the planet. We've heard how ministers can be developed and appointed. We've heard about job opportunities, although the Prime Minister is very clear that they're not absolutely ready. They're not baked yet, but they're out there, which is good. And I think we've heard the origins as well of the law and how it developed over time, but has the flexibility within it to allow it to develop as Asgardia grows. So thank you very much. Efficiency is at the core of all we do. We are finishing 3 minutes early, and I think that's spot on and only the right way to do it. But it's a huge thank you to both of you, to the Prime Minister, to the Chair of Parliament for joining us today to take us through what I hope has been an enjoyable perusal of elements of the Government Act. And I'm very grateful to Merrily and the team who've put this together, and to my colleagues on the committee, the Justice Committee, and of course all those involved in the Ministry of Justice who have pulled these webinars together. So thank you all very much indeed. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.